Andrew, how are you today?
Great. Good. How about you, Catherine?
It's a great day.
It is. It is. So, just to jump right into it, I'm sure if you guys have been to this event before, you've probably seen this slide because this will be my third time presenting here. And this is by far my favorite slide to lead off any presentation. I think it's a good reminder because if all you do is you don't even read the news, you just look at the headlines. Reading the news obviously will guide you in the same direction. It looks like electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles are already taking over everywhere, from the light vehicle side all the way up to the heavy duty side. But when we look at what's actually happening, it tells a completely different story. For instance, there's no shortage of electric announcements when we look at the Class 8 side. Class 8 truck was about 0.2% zero emission vehicle in 2021, and it's on trend to double that to 0.5% in 2022. Same thing, medium commercial vehicle. We do have school buses that are really driving battery electric growth in that segment. So class 6 and 7 look strong at about almost 2%, but that's the vast majority of that lies in school bus.
Andrew, we're talking about almost a rounding error, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're still well over 90% in total for light, medium, and heavy commercial. We're beyond 99% still internal combustion engine powertrain.
Right.
So that's why this slide is important, because this looks at what are the 6 main points in the industry that all work together in order to drive. And when does that future technology adoption happen? So we've got OEMs, fleets, suppliers, charging infrastructure, utility infrastructure, and regulations. You've got regulations that kind of force some of this to happen maybe faster than everybody wants, which pushes the OEMs into having certain products available. And what we see now is most OEMs have a product available, have it in the marketplace, but most of those products are still in the test phases. So they're still only out there in test fleets, not available for anyone to go out and purchase. You either have to be part of a test fleet program, you have to subscribe in some way to these vehicles, and provide feedback on the vehicles as well. It doesn't stop fleets from wanting these vehicles. I know there are fleets that are out there looking at TCO and saying, hey, this works for my business case. I need these, and that is going to also help drive adoption as these fleets need them. And then we look at the architecture advancements. So this one kind of plays in with charging, actually with all of it. Moving into higher voltage vehicle architectures will allow certain benefits, especially in relation to charging time. So right now we have a very long charging time. You have some vehicles, yes, DC fast charge can get you relatively low, maybe down to 30 to 45 minutes. But moving to an 800 volt architecture, maybe not long term, but at least short term, can reduce the charge time down to what it takes to currently fill a tank of diesel. The problem is installing a charging infrastructure now to support DC fast charge on the current voltage architectures. If you, as a fleet, move to this new vehicle architecture, it's likely that all of that charging infrastructure that's been put in place is going to need to be revamped or replaced in order to meet those advanced charge times, which poses a problem. If a fleet adopts vehicles today, invest in all of this infrastructure, will they, or how soon will they need to reinvest in a charging infrastructure to be able to support their changing fleet? And then one of the more important ones, especially where we look at where a lot of this adoption is happening. Kathryn, I'm talking about your home state here,
right?
California. There's already a lot of strain on the utility infrastructure. So how are the utilities going to be able to support this moving forward? And And that's one of the big things. I talked about school bus being a big early adopter. School buses are a great use case for battery electric because they're only on the road essentially twice per day, once to pick up the kids in the morning and once to drop them off at the end of the day. And the rest of the day they sit idle. So they can be parked on a lot, plugged in, and then that school bus lot becomes essentially a giant battery bank that can then backfeed the grid to help support a lot of these peak events. Because realistically, most of the electrical infrastructure can support the average loads. It's the peak loads where there's struggle. So, or weather events that happen. So if there's a battery bank that already exists that can help smooth out the curve, that will certainly help. But like I said, we're still less than 2% of school bus, or less than 2% of 6-7, which is majority school bus.
And Andrew, last month, we literally had texts every day from California Grid saying, shut everything down.
Yeah. So how does that impact a business opportunity? Like Kathryn said, 80% of the GDP is driven by commercial of some sort. That's a big risk to the business model to not be able to use the vehicles. And then regulations. So when we look at emissions regulations, there's a 3-year cycle that we've been on now, moving towards GHG 2.0, which will end in 2027. So we have the next event in 2024, and then that one is already decided. We have a proposed, it hasn't been fully accepted yet for 2027.
And Andrew, can you take a second and explain that a little tiny bit? So those are actually the periods of time where they've said something's going to happen. They've set a date, right?
Yes. Yep. So the EPA in this case has set those dates as tailpipe emission milestones. So a vehicle that's going to operate on public roads has to meet these tailpipe emissions by 2024. You have to have a certain amount of NOx and particle emissions that come out of the tailpipe, or you can't sell your vehicles, which is what Hino experienced in 2021 and is still recovering from now. So it's a very costly mistake for OEMs to not be able to meet those emissions timings. And those emissions regulations are not just on diesel, they're also for gasoline or natural gas or any other fuel that goes into the vehicle. If there is a tailpipe emission, it's measured. Obviously, electric vehicles don't have tailpipe emissions, so they're not measured. And this does not take into account well-to-wheel emissions, which well-to-wheel is kind of the holistic view of the vehicle. So from building any part that goes onto the vehicle or creating the fuel that goes into the vehicle, what emissions are put out, in which case there's arguments that electric vehicles are on par with diesel. And the best case scenario is a natural gas or recycled natural gas hybrid. Those provide the best well-to-wheel emissions.
Right.
So that's kind of a brief view of where we're at now. So what we're seeing in the future is 23% of all purchases in 2030 will be zero-emission vehicles. And right now, zero-emission vehicles are battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. And over the last 6 months, we've seen about a 1% increase in that. So
and when you say all purchases, you're looking at commercial class 1 through 8?
Commercial class 2B through 8 in this case.
2B, okay.
Yep, 2B. So that's it's a little bit on the, it could be seen either as conservative or aggressive depending on.
But everything is like that now, Andrew, right?
Yeah.
Everything is, you're going to pick something and there's people that are saying way over here and people that are really the opposite, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and especially when you look at, I know I mentioned the very small percentage that is battery electric or zero emission today. moving towards that target, all of these OEMs are investing in this technology. They've essentially pulled back on internal combustion investments and are focusing all of that R&D budget on zero emission vehicles. So there will be a certain percentage, a substantial growth that's going to happen between now and 2030. It's just a matter of how much. And if there's one thing I can tell you about this number is I know it's going to be wrong. we're looking 7-8 years out in the future here. But that's our best guess based on the amount of investment that's happening on the vehicle side, the supply side, and is expected to happen on the infrastructure side. We do expect to see a substantial amount of growth, still not pushing towards that 50% mark until closer to halfway through the century here. But
this will be something that California will have to deal with because their expectations are very different.
Yep. And even moving towards that 2030 timeframe, we do expect it to be, regardless of what the total percentage is, there will be a high mix of vehicle models offered, and each of those will retain a relatively low volume compared to the ICE variants that are also offered.
Right. Well, like you said, buses and final mile, right?
Yep. Yeah, school. So that's the other thing, and we'll talk about a little bit of this when we get into the specific class breakdowns. But electric vehicles make sense for certain vocations or certain applications or certain use cases. They don't make sense for all of them. The same thing that we're seeing on the light vehicle side, where it makes sense in a lot of cases and a lot of lifestyles, it makes sense, even outside of commercial, but it's not in all cases that it makes perfect sense right now.
Right.
So to jump into something a little bit different, but slightly related to the electric story, is autonomy or autonomous vehicles. Same kind of thing. If every day when I read the news or even just scan through the headlines of what's out there, there's no shortage of excitement and interest around autonomous vehicles, especially in the Class 8 space. Class 8 is expected to be one of the big drivers here. There are already a lot of partnerships and test routes that are being run by fleets and autonomy companies, and even OEMs and autonomy companies. But what we really see is that OEM installed autonomy is still lagging a little bit behind what's happening right now. Biggest reason for that is there is expected to be regulation that will come to help the transition between non-autonomous vehicles and fully autonomous vehicles. So in the meantime, there will be a lot of the ADAS or the advanced driver assistance systems that are out there that will help make vehicles safer, help make it easier for drivers to maneuver these vehicles, but they won't be fully autonomous. So just to briefly go through the levels of autonomy, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with these. These are the SAE levels of autonomy that we forecasted here. Level 0, there's nothing. There's sensors that will tell you what's happening, but there's no driver assistance that actually happens. Level 1 driver assistance is either front to back or side to side assistance, not both. It's just one or the other. So it's either like a lane keep assistance or adaptive cruise, but not both at the same time. Level 2 is both at the same time. So it would do lane keep assist and adaptive cruise at the same time. Level 3 starts to bring in driving automation. So we call this conditional driving automation. So this one, the vehicle can be autonomous, but there are limitations to the autonomy. So for instance, it could just be autonomous once you get on the highway. So if you're on a highway, it will be autonomous from the second that you enter the highway to the second you leave the highway, and then the driver needs to take over. So you still are required to have a driver in the vehicle. Level 4 and 5 are really the full autonomous vehicles. Level 4 gives you high driving automation. where you can't operate the vehicle in all circumstances. Doesn't mean that you couldn't autonomously run the route from your dock all the way to the final destination. It just means that there may be weather related, there may be some road type restrictions, but there's some restriction on that driving automation that exists. But a driver is not required for level 4 or level 5. Level 4 and level 5 are essentially the same, except for some restrictions on that level 4 side.
And there is some work being done, more work being done on the off-road automation,
Yes.
which is, of course, makes sense, like mines and agriculture and a variety of different applications where it makes sense. It's not on the road.
Yeah. Well, especially like you mentioned, when you don't have to worry about other vehicles or other drivers that are on the road, there's a lot, I don't want to say freedom, but there's a lot more opportunity that exists in that space for that than the on-highway at this point. Right.
Well, I know I read an article not that long ago that said there's been kind of a readjustment, a mental readjustment for the excitement that came out, and the amount of money that's been invested in it, and now resetting the horizon.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Right.
But just to talk briefly about the forecast that we have here, we do see about 45% of new Class 8 vehicles will be equipped with level 2 automation by 2030. So we do see that growing substantially through the horizon, with level 1 right now kind of peaking, and then we're going to start to see that transition start where level 1 vehicles are going to move to level 2 vehicles.
Yes, it surprised me the last time I rented a car.
Yeah. So while we're talking about Class 8, just thought I would talk briefly about what's kind of happening in the Class 8 space right now. No real switch since the last time we talked between the tractor and truck splits. Still about 74-26% on those. Tractor are, just to help understand that, tractor are traditionally what's used to pull trailers, either regional haul or long haul. Trucks are what are upfit for vocational applications. So cement mixers, dump trucks, box trucks, for the few that exist in that space. But that's the tractor versus truck. Electrification is expected to be about 18%. That's a very slight increase. I think we're about 1% up by 2030. And that's just based on the new activity. Volvo is very heavily focused on battery electric. Daimler with the e-Cascadia that they've now launched full production of. But we're still not seeing a substantial bump in what we had predicted previously.
And that 18%, is it proportioned tractor, truck similarly?
Most of it right now is on tractor. We do see it happening on trucks for certain vocations.
Right.
But
final mile, right?
Yep. Final mile. Refuse is a big taker right now.
Oh, right.
Of it.
Absolutely. I've seen a lot of that.
Yeah. And refuse is a whole interesting market that's happening right now with the switch to battery electric and how all that works. So just anecdotally, heard that Chicago had bought some battery electric refuse trucks, a fleet of 3 or 6, something like that. But they're not using them right now. They use them and like, hey, we need to just run a route really quick to go take care of something, or we have a truck that's down, we need to send a truck out there. But they're finding that they're only able to run 6-ish hours on a charge before they have to recharge it, which is hard.
Yep.
But when you look at where some of these operate, if you can plan the fleet around,
right,
you know where these have to drive, you know how far they have to go, there is opportunity that exists for growth in the zero emission space.
Although Chicago winter, summer is going to be really different for electric vehicles as well, too, isn't it?
Absolutely. Weather will play a huge part there.
Yeah.
The other thing too that is starting to show up in Class 8 and will start to trickle down to the rest of the commercial landscape is hydrogen as a fuel.
Yep.
Also known as hydrogen ICE, also known as H2 ICE. I heard it called all of these different things. So hydrogen as a fuel for diesel replacement essentially is going to
Right.
be a big topic moving forward, and part of why we see such relatively low volumes in zero emission space, because production already exists for diesel engines. The production is still being created for everything related to battery electric vehicles. So since that production already exists, if you can refit that engine, make some changes to the head, the fueling system, all of that, refit it for hydrogen, start to build up that hydrogen infrastructure, there's a real opportunity for that to grow, as well as bolster the zero emission vehicle side for fuel cell moving forward.
Exactly. In fact, I was at the NTEA's executive summit last week, and one of the OEMs talked about the fact that they were basically going to be 50% hydrogen ICE very soon.
Yeah. Infrastructure is the biggest hurdle there that is still currently being worked on.
Yep.
So moving down into class 4 through 7, school bus. I talked about that before. School bus is expected to be 44% battery electric by 2030, and we're up several percent in this case here, and that continues to grow pretty rapidly out through 2035. I think we're moving closer to 60% battery electric by even the middle of that decade.
Well, I think it's really great that not only is a use case clear, but the concept of the grid, it being part of the grid, is a really big concept, right?
Yeah. Well, and it'll be interesting to see how that is deployed, because my thought would be that the vehicle to grid infrastructure would be available for any fleet that wanted to participate in it.
Right.
So, or shoot, even a dealership, if a dealership is stocking electric vehicles or has a stock of electric vehicles that they're only going out for test drives for a week, there may be some way to save money on your electric bill by participating in that V2G or vehicle to grid.
Well, I think grid demand, part of what's helping make more things opportunistic, right, is just the ability to have software that can do grid management and fleet management and all that kind of stuff, because we are to that place where we have machine learning and AI and all of the things that can support that intelligence that's needed to cross between all of these applications in real time. But I think I think it's going to be very interesting outside of California, where the utilities are going to be able to focus on that kind of being able to evolve. California is under a lot of pressure for so many reasons on utilities, including fires and all of that. But this is going to be we'll have to have in our spring one, we'll have to focus on this. It'll be very interesting, Andrew.
Yeah. And the last thing that I just want to share on the medium side is on hybrid. Hybrid vehicles are not talked about very much in the commercial space right now. We expect that to change moving closer to the 2027 timeframe. The last point I have on this slide, that gas and diesel powered vehicles will become more expensive. That 2027 emissions target is very difficult to hit from both gasoline and diesel power perspective. One of the big topics that especially the big three are discussing right now is hybridizing all of the diesel and gas engines that go into these vehicles as a strategy to meet those targets. That's a great bridge into battery electric, and it helps electrify some of the use cases that couldn't go full electric.
Sure.
But the one key thing is it's going to make these vehicles more expensive.
And it's going to take away their ability to carry more weight.
Exactly. And actually, that's a really good segue into the light commercial vehicle, because light commercial vehicle is one of the biggest takers of, continues to be one of the biggest takers of electric vehicles on the van side,
Right.
specifically for last mile delivery. But when you look at the weight penalty that you have moving from say a Ford Transit into a Bright Drop Zevo 600, it's pretty substantial. You have all the space that's there, but there's a massive weight penalty that comes along with that switch.
Marshmallows and pillows, right?
Yeah. It's not stopping any of the major fleets from taking these vehicles and putting them through their paces, using them. I know even around the Detroit area here, I've seen Bright Drops delivering for Amazon. I've seen Bright Drops delivering for FedEx. It is happening, but that's on the large fleet side. We've built that into our forecast that we expect these large fleets to make up a majority of this early adoption of electric commercial vehicles.
Right.
So kind of summarizing everything here, we've got emissions regulations and fuel strategy. So we talked a little bit about available fuel as far as infrastructure and technology goes for the charging infrastructure and hydrogen side. Looking at hydrogen, that's the biggest negative that we see towards hydrogen as a fuel. Right now, the US is I think we're still about 5 years behind Europe from an infrastructure standpoint. And Europe is still not quite there to be able to support mass adoption of hydrogen. So we have a long way to go. But the opportunity is there to build that up for, instead of just supporting fuel cell vehicles, which are still, there's very few that are on the road. Hyundai with their Class 8 may be the most prominent one. But that's only just in testing yet. That's not even a production-ready vehicle. But building up that infrastructure for hydrogen is only going to help, number one, available fuels. Number two, that may be the solution. If we can get there over the next 5 years, that may be the solution. And hybrid gasoline and diesel doesn't need to be as prevalent because we can move into more hydrogen to support that.
Right.
But EPA and CARB versus the OEMs. The OEMs have to do what EPA and CARB tell them, which is build zero emission vehicles, because I've mentioned that the regulations are established for 24. They should be established very soon for 2027. But beyond 2027, there really hasn't been much from a national standpoint, EPA side, discussion on what's going to happen in 2030. CARB, I know, is pushing very heavily on the percentage of zero emission vehicles that will need to exist,
right,
2030 and beyond. But that's not, just because that's what they say needs to happen, doesn't mean that the timing is feasible or possible to hit.
And sometimes they've changed their timing sometimes, haven't they?
Yep, they absolutely have. It's not unprecedented that these regulations have been adjusted.
Right. For reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because what looks good in a vacuum doesn't always transfer to what can happen
right
in reality. Biggest thing for fleets that I mentioned earlier is total cost of ownership. So finding parity between total cost of ownership, and Kathryn and I even had this discussion.
We did
earlier this week. Total cost of ownership gets thrown out all the time. I see it. Oh, it's the same cost to own both a diesel-powered vehicle as it is to own a battery electric vehicle. Well, what is included in those calculations of TCO can vary wildly. Whether you include just the vehicle cost. So the vehicle acquisition cost, the maintenance, the fueling, that's one way to do it. You can take it further and include charging infrastructure, because it becomes easier to install a charging infrastructure on a fleet property than it does to install a diesel fuel station at a fleet headquarters. And then you can include the opportunity cost that comes along with it, because where you've got, call it on the high end, 15 minutes to refuel a diesel, you've got substantially more than that to recharge battery electric. So the opportunity cost and the training cost that exists between those.
I think total is really total, that you really should sit down and, you know, figure that out. And training could be a big part of it. And of course, we were talking about how different it is to be handling electricity too.
Yeah.
Safety and all sorts of stuff. So
absolutely. But the one thing that I know I'm sure of moving forward is that the vehicle use case will determine the fuel strategy for the fleet. So it will not be in the future one fuel strategy. It will not be just battery electric vehicles in the future. There will exist, and ICE has a long road ahead of it, especially with the hydrogen as a fuel in there.
Well, Andrew, I really appreciate your bringing this forward to discuss and to talk about. And I know that you're available if anybody follow-up has questions. We'll give them some contact. We have some big announcements about Andrew and his group midday today. And so thank you, everybody. And I guess now we're going to head off into the next episode with a lovely fireside chat with Jim Press. Thanks, Andrew.